Peace, everyone. Welcome to the Baruti Libre Show, and I'm your host, Baruti Libre Kafele. My topic for the Baruti Libre Show today is a brief understanding of the conflict in Syria. I'll repeat, a brief understanding of the conflict in Syria. Now, Syria is a country that we've heard repetitiously within the media during the past couple of years, I would say, and also recently, because they're undergoing a very bloody, pugnacious, and also volatile civil war at the moment between the Assad government, or people that are loyal to the Assad government, and also a lot of the rebels, the Islamist rebels within that area. But in order to have an understanding of what's going on in Syria contemporaneously, I want to speak about things historically and also culturally. Now, Syria is a very heterogeneous country, meaning that its population is very diverse. You have Sunni Muslims there, Shia Muslims there, you have Yazidis there, you have Alawites, you have Armenians, you have the Kurds in the north, you have Druze there, you have various ethnicities within Syria going back to centuries ago. Now, that's the situation at hand in Syria as it relates to the population. Now, the people that run Syria, or the ruling minority within Syria, are the Alawites. You have 70 to 75% of the country, which is Sunni Muslim, and then you have 12%, which are Alawites. Now, Alawite is a sect within Shia Islam, and they are esoteric. They have a syncretistic kind of religiosity, or a syncretistic kind of culture in their Shiites. But the thing is that Sunnis look at them as infidels, as apostates, and also as people that are non-believers because of the way that they practice. Like, for example, now, Alawites do not go to the masjid, number one. And also, their females don't wear hijabs. Hijabs are veils, or should I say, the cloth or the covering that women wear within Islam, or should I say, traditional Islam. So, with the Alawites, they've had a very conflictual relationship with the Sunnis traditionally. That's the type of situation that they had. So the thing is that even going back into the 15th century in the city of Aleppo, which is predominantly Sunni Islam, in the 15th century, there was a time in which Sunni clerics, or should I say Sunni officials, invited Alawite clerics to the city of Aleppo. So when they invited them there, it was under their trap, and what happened was that these Alawite clerics were decapitated. And also, not to mention, with the Alawites, one may ask, how did they get into power within Syria if they're the minority of the population being disenfranchised and also being oppressed by the Sunnis? And also, not to mention, we have to understand that Syria was under the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was a very indomitable and militaristic empire at one time, and they were in power from around 1299 all the way up until 1921, after the end of World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Severus, and various other treaties which abolished World War I, and also demarcated and dichotomized the Middle East, and I'm going to get into that very soon. Or should I say, created the geopolitically designated Middle East. So what happened was this. There was an agreement which was conspired around the time of World War I, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, this agreement was between two diplomats, and another name of the Sykes-Picot Agreement is the Asia Minor Agreement. Now, with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it's between a British diplomat by the name of Mark Sykes and also a French diplomat by the name of Francois-Picot. And what they wanted to do was demarcate and dichotomize the geopolitically designated area of the Middle East, which is the eastern part of Europe, the northern part of Africa, and the western part of Asia. And what they wanted to do was this. They wanted to divide it between the British Empire, the French Empire, and lastly, they wanted to divide it between the Russian Empire, or should I say Tsarist Russia, before the Bolshevik Revolution, which occurred during October of 1917, in which the communists began to take over Russia from 1917, 1918, all the way up until the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, according to the agreement, the British Empire would, in essence, control and also colonize southern Iraq, and also the Mediterranean River, and also the Jordan River, the strip between that location, if you will, and also parts of Turkey. Now, according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement with the French will control northern Iraq, Lebanon, and also Syria. But the thing is this, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was exposed by Bolshevik Russia, because after the Russian Revolution, that was when they published this agreement. So what this led to was embarrassment. That's what they exacerbated or capitalized to with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But then again, years later, after World War I, that's when we had the Treaty of Severus. And with the Treaty of Severus, that's where a lot of the machinations or the plans or the colonial plans of the Sykes-Picot Agreement became actualized, if you will. So what happened was this. Under the Treaty of Severus, which was after the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, with the Treaty of Severus, that's where you had the colonization of the geopolitically designated Middle East for the purpose of European colonial aggrandizement politically, and also economically, and also geographically, because of a lot of the resources within that region, in which you had the creation and the implementation of the mandate system. You had the French mandate, and under the French mandate, you had, under their occupation, Syria, and you had Lebanon. And then under the British mandate, you had Iraq, and then you had Palestine, and then eventually you had the monarchy of Transjordan. I would say circa 1921 and 1922. But guess what? You had the indirect rule with the British Empire with their mandates, and then with the French you had the direct rule. So with the direct rule, that's where you had, as aforementioned, Lebanon and Syria, and what they wanted to do in order to maintain their colonial prizes, what they wanted to do was divide and conquer, similarly to what the British did in India, or should I say the Indian Peninsula, similar to what they did around the time of the 18th and 19th century. So that's what they did with Syria, and they did that by the creation of the Alawite state. So what they did was empower the minorities in order to stabilize the majority within that area, because as aforementioned, the Sunnis are 70 to 75% of Syria. So with the creation of the Alawite state, that's where we started to see Alawites begin the nation build. That's where we see Alawites started to become empowered and started to be able to provide for themselves, politically, economically, socially, what have you. But then eventually, you saw the dismantling, or people saw the dismantling of the Alawite state around the time of 1946 when the French left Syria. And then Syria started to accumulate its independence. But then again, a year later, 1947, that's where we saw the creation of a movement which became very influential and also revolutionized things within that region around the time of 1947. And that was the creation of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party was a party which was founded by someone by the name of Salah ad-Din al-Bittar and someone by the name of Michael Aflaq. And the purpose of that party was to propagate, promote, and also to politicize Arab secularism, Arab humanism, Arab political power, Arab economic and political cooperation throughout that region. Because around that time, that's where we started to see a lot of decolonization movements, because that was the time of the conclusion of World War II. And with the conclusion of World War II, a lot of the European empires started to become economically perilous, and also they started to become politically and militaristically exhausted. So with that happening, that's when we started to see a lot of these kingdoms, a lot of these colonies, a lot of these mandates which were colonized, or should I say controlled or authorized under these European powers, they started to become independent. And also this is around the time of Israel started to become independent with their own nation after the dismantling of the British mandate system within that region. Started in May of 1948, and then that's where we saw the beginnings, or should I say the recent beginnings as it relates to recent history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but that's another subject matter right there. Now, with Syrian independence and also with the creation of the Ba'ath Party, the Alawites saw that as a problem, because from there the French was the colonial power which protected them, which fortified them, which made sure that things were straight with them since they were a minority and since they still are a minority within that area. So the Allies saw a solution for them to accumulate power via the military. So we started to see a lot of Allies join the military to the point at which in 1955, out of the non-commissioned officials within Syria, within the Syrian army, 65% of the army, the non-commissioned officials, were Alawites. Now, 12% of the population, but guess what? They made up 65% of the army. Now, that's a staggering number right there. So then around that time, between 1955 all the way up until 1970, we started to see continuous and consecutive coup d'etats happen, in which you would have one group of people get in power, then they'll get ousted, and then this would just be a continuous thing. So we saw a lot of destabilization movements, we saw a lot of insurrectionary movements, and we saw a whole lot of coups happening. And then eventually in 1970, we saw the Alawites come into power under Hafiz al-Assad, who was the father of the current president, Bashar al-Assad within Syria. So then, within that time frame, we started to see the coup d'etat and then the Allies come into power. So in order to maintain their power, in order to become legitimate, Hafiz al-Assad, he was militaristically minded, and also he was very intelligent. What he did was provide incentives for the wealthy people, the wealthy Sunnis within that area, the wealthy Sunni Muslims, because they're the majority of the people within that area, the wealthy and affluent ones, so that he was able to provide opportunities for them, economic incentives, and in exchange, they were reciprocated with compliance and also with acquiescence, meaning that the Sunnis complied with the Alawites, or should I say the Ba'ath Party, or should I say the Assad regime, in exchange for the incentives. And also, number two, the Assad regime also brought about protection and also fortification for a lot of the other minorities, whether we talk about the Druze, whether we talk about the Armenians, whether we talk about the Christians, whether we talk about the Yazidis, whether we talk about the Kurds, any other minorities in Syria, the Assad regime provided protection and fortification for them. And yet then again at the same time, this was around the time of the Cold War era. With the Cold War era, that's where we saw the bipolarity of power between the United States, which was for liberal democracy, which is for capitalism, which is for free enterprise, things of that nature, and then the communists, or should I say the USSR, which is for socialism, communism, humanism, and democracy based on their interpretation or the implication of that concept. So we saw bipolarity in power, and what they wanted to do was gain as much control as possible geographically, politically, and socially, with their justification being the aforementioned ideals, whether we talk about democracy, capitalism, communism, whatever the case may be. So what happened was this: the United States started to notice the rebelliousness of Syria under Assad, Hafiz al-Assad. Number one, with him siding with Egypt as it relates to militarily intervening into Israel. Because as we know, Israel started to become influential, and of course, a lot of Muslims globally within the Ummah, and also a lot of Muslims within the political Ummah, whether we talk about Tunisia, whether we talk about Morocco, whether we talk about Saudi Arabia, Jordan, or any other countries within that region, a lot of them are against the existence of the state of Israel. So politically, there were a lot of wars within that time, in which we had the war of 1956, we saw one in 1967, we saw one in 1973, and of course preliminarily the one in 1948, in which we had a lot of the Arab countries unify in order to militarily defeat Israel. But as you know, Syria allied with Egypt as it relates to invading Israel, if you will, because as we know, Israel was very efficacious and victorious with a lot of the wars, whether you talk about the one in 1956 or the one in 1967. So that was what happened. That's number one. And also number two, Syria also invaded or annexed into Lebanon, because they consider Lebanon to be a part of Syria going back into historic times. And according to Assad, according to the historic trajectory, if you will, of Syrian history, Lebanon was always a part of Syria. I mean, also, their justification, or Syria's justification of militarily intervening into Lebanon is because of the fact that they wanted to protect the Christians within the area, the Maronites, if you will. And also, not to mention, it's a geostrategical kind of move, or geostrategical kind of initiative, or activity, if you will, so that they could be able to have control and influence within that region. And also, not to mention, with them intervening into Lebanon, that'll bring them closer to possibly annexing Israel. So the thing is that the United States saw that as a problem. And also, not to mention, in 1979, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Shia Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, Syria sided with Iran. But not to mention, Iran and Iraq, they had a long war going from 1980 all the way up until around 1987, 88. They had the Iraq-Iranian war. But guess what? Iraq under Saddam Hussein was under the Ba'ath Party, which is the same party as the party that Hafiz Assad was a part of before he passed away, if you will. But also the same party that his son is a part of, the Ba'ath Party, Bashar al-Assad. So it was an ambiguous situation to the point in which they're both a part of the Ba'ath Party, but instead the Assad regime decided to ally with the Iranians over there. So the thing is that with Iran being an enemy to the United States, because as you know, or as you may not know, the Islamic Revolution was against a US-backed regime, and that was the regime, or the autocracy, or the authoritarian regime of, by the name of Mohammed Shah, who's been in power for centuries, or should I say, pardon me, who's been in power for decades. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself by saying centuries, with all these facts reverberating within my mind, but let me get back to the subject matter at hand. So the thing is that with the United States realizing all this, they said, hold up, this is an irrevocable stake right here. This is an irrevocable agenda that Assad has. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor for President Jimmy Carter, you can look this up. He was for the destabilization and also the regime change within Syria under Assad, because he said, look, this is the problem right there. We cannot have this person in power who's supporting all this. And also not to mention with Assad as well, we could fast forward into times. Syria was one of the only states which was against the intervention in Iraq, against U.S. intervention into Iraq, going back into the early 2000s, also around the time of the Persian Gulf War. So there was an imposition of sanctions on Syria as well, which was agreed upon by various states which was a part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a military cooperation organization which was founded by the United States, Britain, France, Luxembourg, and various other states on April the 4th of 1949. So the thing is that with NATO expanding his influence after the disintegration and the dismantling of the Soviet Union in 1991, and also the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989 in Germany, that was when the United States started to become a unipolar power. So yes, scholars like Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History and The Last Man Standing, which explained or gave the thesis that the United States is the supreme power in the world and that is the end of history. But then again, you had Samuel Huntington, who wrote the book on the Clash of Civilizations, and he wrote various books and scholarly articles as it relates to that, meaning that instead of focusing on the United States and the Soviet Union going into the 21st century, the problem or the conflict will be balkanization, fragmentation, and also division among the world between civilizations going to war with one another. Whether we talk about the Western civilization, the Eastern civilization, the Indian civilization, the African civilization, the Sino civilization, various civilizations, a multi-civilizational war or pugnacious in a confrontational world in which there would just be a continuous war going on. You see what I mean? So the thing is that's what was going on. So when we go into the year 2000, that's where Hafiz al-Assad passed away, and then who took power was Bashar al-Assad, the ophthalmologist, the eye doctor. Because the thing is that he went to school in the UK to study to become an ophthalmologist, but instead he became the head of the government within Syria. And of course, not to mention, this is around the time of the imposition of sanctions, because a year after, that's when we had the 9/11 attacks, we had the intervention into Iraq, and also Syria was against that. And with Syria being against that, with Syria being an ally of Iran, and Iran is very controversial and also a political threat as it relates to U.S. foreign policy, they saw this as a problem. So the United States has been applying for a regime change for a long time with the imposition of sanctions. Isolation of Syria, because as you know, the United States had a lot of allies within the geopolitically designated Middle East. Whether we talk about countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, whether we talk about the Mediterranean Dialogue, which was created by NATO, if you will, or if we were to talk about a lot of the other organizations or the political organizations within that region centralized around a lot of these political states that are allied with the United States, if you will. So the thing is that Syria saw itself in a very vulnerable and precarious situation. And also not to mention, General Wesley Clark, when he was in the Pentagon, he was speaking to top senior officials around the time of 9/11, specifically in November 2001. So when he was speaking with a lot of these top officials, that was when they spoke about intervening into Iraq. And then he said, hold up, not so fast. We plan on destabilizing and bringing about regime change in other countries within that region as well. And according to him, within his memoir, specifically in his book, Winning Modern Wars, he spoke about the regimes, or he spoke about the countries of Libya. He spoke about the country of Somalia. He spoke about Sudan. He spoke about Iran. He spoke about Iraq. He spoke about Syria. So he spoke about those countries as well. So the thing is that General Wesley Clark said that he received direct information from a lot of the top officials within the Pentagon about destabilizing these countries over a period of time in order to create the new Middle East. And this new Middle East is contrary, or should I say, this new Middle East is complementary, to the Yemen plan of the 1980s, because this someone by the name of Adad Yemen within the 1980s, he spoke about Israel being the regional superior state within that region, number one, and also number two, he spoke about the fragmentation of the Middle East, or the fragmentation of Arab countries being in the best interest of Israeli superiority. And also not to mention, this complements a publication which was created by this think tank by the name of the Institute for Advanced and Strategic Political Studies, led by Richard Pearl, and they wrote something called Securing the Realm. So the thing is that with that was about fragmentation of the Middle East as well, and also about the containment of Syria. That's what that was about, if you will. So the thing is that, yeah, various think tanks coming together, or various think tanks right on their own, advising a lot of politicians about how they're going to destabilize the Middle East and how they're going to contain Syria, and also how they're going to suppress Syria as well. So you had a whole lot of that going on. And also, not to mention, you had the Project for the New American Century, which is another right-wing think tank, which consists of people like Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Paul Wolfowitz. And they wrote something called Rebuilding American Defenses. And that was about empowering Israel, and also empowering a lot of the allies within that region, and also containing Syria, and also containing any countries that were not complementary to U.S. foreign policy. And also Syria was unequivocally against that, because they had their own agenda as well, especially under the Assad regime, if you will. In the fast forward times, that was when we saw the Arab Spring in 2011. Now with the Arab Spring, that's what we saw. A lot of the youth within the Arab world want social justice. They wanted the end of the autocracy. They wanted the end of the martial law. They wanted the end of unemployment. They wanted the end of high prices. They wanted the end of the neoliberal reforms, which was stagnated their economies. They wanted peace, justice, jobs, and opportunities. In essence, that's what they wanted within that part of the world, or any other part of the world, but mainly within that part of the world. So it began in the latter part of 2010, early 2011, in Tunisia, with the self-immolation, with the burning of Mohamed Bouazizi. He burned himself in front of a governmental building, which was a form of protest in order to protest against a lot of the unequal laws and the dictatorial regime of Zayn Ben Ali in Tunisia. And then eventually, and during the second week of January, that was when he was ousted, Ben Ali, to the point at which he seek exile in Saudi Arabia. And then in Egypt, that's where we saw their insurrectionary measure, which we saw a lot of the protests happen. And then eventually in February of 2011, that's where we saw the regime change of Hosni Mubarak. That was in Egypt. And then eventually we started to see protests in Libya. And then with the protests in Libya, that was when the civil war ensued. And then that's where we saw the dismantling, the destabilization, and also the regime change in Libya, which led to the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi in October the 20th of 2011. And also, not to mention, we saw protests in Bahrain, we saw protests all around that region. So it was just a multiplicity of protests and also movements going on within that region. And not to mention, we saw something happen in Syria. Because we're speaking about Syria, so let's speak on what happened in Syria. Protests ensued, I would say, around January. But then eventually, that's when the protests began to intensify. And I would say that it was a protest among various groups of people. We could say that it was a democratic situation from the inception, during its embryonic stages, in which people began to organize via social media outlets, whether we talk about Facebook and Twitter. This was what occurred, or this is what ensued. And also, not to mention, what happened was this. In March of 2011, that's when we started to see teenagers in Syria. They started to have graffiti on a lot of buildings. And the graffiti on the buildings, they implicated insurrectionary things, meaning that they were writing things along the lines of saying, we need to oust Assad, or it's time to overthrow the eye doctor, or things of that nature, because like I said, Assad was an ophthalmologist. He went to school to study ophthalmology. So that's what we started to see in Syria. So this was during the beginning. But then, towards the second week of March within 2011 within Syria, that's when we started to see the protests begin to intensify within the city of Aleppo and also within the capital Damascus. So then it started to metamorphosize into something that was violent, to the point in which the United States were bringing about airstrikes and they were funding rebels, if you will. And the thing is that what's propagandized within the media is that these rebels are the Free Syrian Army. But we need to be careful with these classifications, because the Free Syrian Army, according to some people, does not exist. There is no Free Syrian Army. There are a plurality of brigades. The Free Syrian Army is nothing but a monolithic branding of the various brigades and also the various movements of Islamists who are trying to overthrow the Assad regime for the purpose of their political aggrandizement, their political gain, and also for the purpose of economic power. Yeah, various brigades, if you will. Whether we talk about Jabhat al-Nusra, whether we talk about Subar al-Sham, whether we talk about Liwa al-Umma, whether we talk about the various brigades within that region. So the thing is that Free Syrian Army, that is nothing but propagandized indoctrination in order to make people think that these brigades are monolithic, if you will. And also, what we need to understand is this. It's complementary to a lot of the aforementioned plans as it relates to U.S. foreign policy, whether we talk about the Yemen plan for regional superiority of Israel, and also the fragmentation of Syria, and also whether we talk about the plan of a clean break, a strategy for securing the realm, which was created, or should I say, propagated and also written by Richard Pearl, or whether we talk about rebuilding American defenses by the Project of New American Century, or the Project for a New American Century, which consisted of people like Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Cheney, and the various others. So the thing is that it's very complementary as it relates to what's going on within the geopolitically designated Middle East, and also what's going on in Syria, because what we see are various brigades which are fighting for the purpose of political power, and they all want to topple the Assad regime. Now, the United States undeniably is inimical to the Assad regime, and also what we see right now is Russia aiding, funded, and supported the Assad regime by bombing a lot of the members of ISIS, or a lot of the brigades which are sympathizers to ISIS within that region, because ISIS, there was a time in which they controlled the city of Palermo, and Palermo is considered to be a very historical and cultural city within Syria, but of course, the Assad regime, they were able to regain that city with the help of Russia, if you will, when Russia started to intervene militaristically. And also, not to mention, it has been proven and exposed that General Michael Flynn, who was a part of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in 2012, it was a declassified report, you can look it up online, in which he said that there are Salafist organizations, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and also not to mention the Muslim Brotherhood, which is helping to topple the Assad regime. Now, this was back in 2012. And also, according to General Flynn, when he had an interview with Russian TV, Al Jazeera, one of those media outlets, he said that it was a willful decision of the U.S. government in order to turn a blind eye to it. Now, that's somewhat suspicious right there in and of itself. Now, I'm not here to pick sides, but the thing is that we have to understand that according to foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, based on the publications that I mentioned previously, and also not to mention, according to the United States interests, and also according to the United States being allies with countries like Turkey and also countries of the Gulf, which is for the toppling of the Assad regime, then it makes you think. ISIL being in the region, is that within the best interest of the United States, or is that dialectical to the interest of the United States, or is it just both? Because we have to understand, Jabhat al-Nusra was considered to be an ally of the United States during the inception of the Syrian Civil War, but then again, they were classified as a terrorist organization, I would say a year and a half, 2 years ago. And also, not to mention a lot of the other brigades, whether we talk about the Farouk Brigade or the Khalid bin Walid Brigade. The Farouk Brigade, they were considered to be a moderate group of rebels, according to the Wall Street Journal, which is a Western media outlet. The Wall Street Journal, they consider the Farouk Brigade to be a moderate rebel group. But then again, not to mention, they bombed a hospital, Al-Qusayr hospital within Syria. Now, I don't know what's moderate about bombing a hospital with innocent patients, if you will. And that's historically proven, that's verifiable, that's corroborated right there. And also not to mention, they charge jizya. Jizya is the Arabic word for taxes to minority groups who are not Islamic. Meaning that if you're not a Muslim, you gotta pay tax. So the thing is that we had the Farouk Brigade bombing hospitals, we had the Khalid bin Walid Brigade as well, wearing paraphernalia similar to Al-Qaeda. So the thing is that it makes us think, is the Free Syrian Army, or the so-called Free Syrian Army, are they really moderates? Are they really for the liberation of Syria? Or are they just another terrorist organization with an agenda that wants to Islamize that area for the purpose of them accumulating power at the expense of a lot of people who may not be a part of the Islamic classification? So it makes us think, is this another situation in which the United States was involved in Afghanistan? Is this a similar situation with the United States and Afghanistan, in which what they did was they trained the Mujahideen in Pakistan, and also they funded Hezb al-Islam and also Jamaat al-Islam, and those were actually organizations which were led by Afghani leaders by the name of Rabbani, and also someone by the name of Jamaat al-Matir, who eventually became a part of Al-Qaeda, and also someone by the name of Hekmatir, Jabbar Hekmatir. As a matter of fact, he's a part of Al-Qaeda now, and also he's considered to be on the terrorist list as it relates to, or the most wanted list as it relates to the U.S. government, if you will. So the thing is this. These are people who are allies in the United States, but then eventually they became terrorists. Now, is this the situation in Syria? Well, we do not even know. The thing is that, according to what you read, some people may say that, while others may say that, as it relates to the United States, what they want is regime change in Syria, but at the same time, they don't want the toppling of the state. But then again, it's a very complicated situation in Syria. It's a very ambiguous one. So we don't know what the agenda is of the United States within that area. We don't know what the agenda of Russia is, but from the outside looking in, it looks like a proxy war within that area, in which you have the United States having their rebels fighting against the Assad regime and lawyers of the Assad regime, and also people that are part of the Assad regime who may be insurgents, if you will, who are fighting against the counter-insurgents who are for a principality, a Salafist principality within the East, which will possibly be ISIL-Daesh, because ISIL did build an Islamic principality or a Salafist principality within Eastern Syria for the purpose of accumulating power, and also for the purpose of toppling the Assad regime. So in saying all this, there's a lot going on in Syria. It's a very ambiguous situation. It's a very complex and complicated situation. And what we need to do is we need to read, we need to study, and also we need to understand things for what they are by ascertaining as much facts as possible. But the thing is that with the situation in Syria, it is a very tough one, and I think that the situation in Syria is manipulated and also perverted, because you have a lot of groups of people externally, whether we talk about Turkey, whether we talk about Saudi Arabia, the United States, Israel, whether we talk about Russia and other states, all intervening into Syria directly or indirectly for their own respective agendas. So the conflict in Syria is very complex, but the thing is that one can still have a basic understanding of it. So in the meantime, this is my episode of the Baruti Libre Show. Take care, peace and love.